I recently saw this video entitled The Best Optical Illusion in the World. There's a link to the video below in the comments in case you wish to review the video yourself. It sounded so plausible, and I wondered why I had never heard this argument before against the existence of God. The author makes the argument that praying to God gets you the same possible answers as praying to a jug of milk, and so every answer to prayer is only a coincidence. Thus, God is no different than a jug of milk, and so the author concludes, therefore, God is imaginary. However, the more I thought about this argument, the more something didn't seem to be right. I began to realize that this argument was actually based on faulty assumptions, faulty understanding, faulty data, and faulty logic. The following is what I discovered about the argument that was advanced in the video. Whether the author knows it or not, the author of that video is playing a game of fallacy. The author's entire argument is a red herring. The game of fallacy has been played by atheists forever. They start with a premise about some quality ascribed to God. If God ... and then assert that God does not meet that quality and therefore does not exist. In this case, the author's argument is essentially, if God existed, then God would answer prayers. But all answers to prayers are a coincidence. Therefore, God does not exist. The author asserts that praying to a jug of milk can produce the same potential answers as praying to God, and thus, quote, God is no different than a jug of milk, unquote. Here is the author's argument. The author compares the potential answers from prayers to God with the potential answers from prayers to a jug of milk. The potential answers to praying to God and the potential answers from praying to a jug of milk are the same: yes, no, and wait. However, everyone knows that all answers from prayers to a jug of milk are merely a coincidence. The reason that all answers from prayers to a jug of milk are merely a coincidence is because the jug of milk is not alive. Now, because the potential answers from praying to God are the same as the potential answers from praying to a jug of milk, then all answers from prayers to God must likewise be merely a coincidence. The author attempts to bolster this assertion with some scientific studies that, as you shall see, actually do not even address the question. Then the author concludes that the reason that all answers from prayers to God are merely a coincidence is because, like the jug of milk, God too is not alive. Therefore, God is imaginary. QED. This argument contains at least 3 logic traps. The first logic trap is that just because the potential answers from praying to God versus praying to a jug of milk are the same, does not mean that the same reason, the same cause, drives the potential answers in each case. In other words, it is a fallacy to conclude that just because the answers from prayers to a jug of milk are all a coincidence because it is not alive, then even if it is true that all answers from prayers to God are also merely a coincidence, that it must therefore follow that God also must not be alive. This leap in logic is an example of the logic trap, correlation does not imply causation. In other words, that they both have the same potential answers does not, by necessity, mean that the reason, the cause behind their answers is the same in both cases. The reason, the cause must be proved, not assumed. One must prove that the same reason, the same cause, determines why each set of potential answers is the same in both cases. One cannot just assume it. In other words, first, the author must prove, not just assume, that all answers from prayers to a jug of milk can only be a coincidence. Second, the author must likewise prove that all answers from prayers to God can only be a coincidence. Then the author must prove, not just assume, that the same reason, the same cause, is behind why the answers are only a coincidence in each case. That is, the author must independently prove, third, what is the reason, the cause, behind why the answers from a jug of milk are only a coincidence? And fourth, what is the reason, the cause behind why the answers from God are only a coincidence? And then, fifth, the author must show that the same reason, the same cause, is the only reason, the only cause in both cases. In other words, even if all answers from prayers to God are only a coincidence, always and every time, the author must still prove that, like the jug of milk, God is not alive. The author cannot just assume this reason, this cause. The author must still prove what is the reason, the cause in each case, in order to prove that in both cases, the same reason, the same cause is behind the same answers. So the purpose behind the author making his video, which is to prove that God does not exist, cannot be accomplished in the manner that the author pursued, because as you shall see, it is impossible for the author to obtain the necessary proofs, such as, for example, proof that all answers from all prayers can only be a coincidence, much less proof that God does not exist. Thus, the author's argument is a fallacy. The second logic trap is exclusive alternatives. That is, when presented with two options, it is assumed that they are mutually exclusive. The author assumes that all answers to prayers can only be either coincidental or intentional, but not both. But this too is a logic trap. That is, that we are given only two mutually exclusive options regarding all prayers. The author assumes that all answers to prayers to the jug of milk can only be a coincidence. But just because the jug of milk is inanimate and cannot grant requests does not stop God or someone else from answering the prayer, even though the prayer was made to the jug of milk. In other words, we know the jug of milk did not hear and answer the prayer, but that does not mean that someone else didn't hear and answer the prayer. For example, God may have answered the prayer in spite of the fact that the prayer was made to a jug of milk. Or God may have answered someone else's prayer made on behalf of the person who prayed to the jug of milk. Or God may have inadvertently answered the prayer because God knew of the person's need, and it had nothing whatever to do with the prayer to the jug of milk. But in any case, the prayer was still answered deliberately, intentionally by God. To be clear, we are talking about the reason for the answer. That is it coincidental or is it intentional? Thus, the answer to the prayer could be both simultaneously, coincidental and intentional. That is, coincidental to the prayer to the jug of milk, but also intentional by God. Thus, the answer to the prayer is not necessarily exclusively coincidental versus intentional, but could be both. And the author's assumption of two mutually exclusive options is an example of another logic trap. Now, there is a third logic trap, which is solution by redefining the problem. The author is addressing the question by redefining the term equivalence. This is another logic trap, in which a problem is solved by redefining the problem. That is, avoiding the problem through a change in definition. The author declares that two things are equivalent because they provide the same potential answers, not because they are actually equivalent per se. The author states that because the same potential answers exist for both the prayers to a jug of milk and the prayers to God, God and the jug of milk are equivalent. That is, quote, God is no different than a jug of milk, unquote. So let's actually compare a jug of milk and God. The jug of milk exists, and the author is asserting that God does not exist. So if the author is correct, then they would clearly not be equivalent. In other words, one can safely conclude that something that exists is not equivalent to something that does not exist. Alternatively, if God does exist, then God is a living, thinking, rational, logical, powerful being that created everything. And a jug of milk is only an inanimate object without life or thought. Thus, on its face, there is absolutely no basis to conclude that they are equivalent in any capacity. Thus, you can see how the author avoids the question regarding whether it is legitimate to be comparing a jug of milk and God in the first place, and the obvious absurdity of doing so by redefining the term equivalence to mean things having the same potential answers. Thus, another logic trap. Now, the reason logic traps are so effective in building plausible arguments is that they sound so plausible, so reasonable, so rational, and we love jumping to conclusions. But once you have distilled the argument down, the logic traps become visible, and the argument collapses. So let's move on to the author's argument. The author's underlying assertion that forms the crux of his entire argument is that all answered prayers are a coincidence. This assertion is not unique, but actually arises from a more fundamental assumption, frequently cited by many atheistic scientists. Because God does not exist, everything must happen for some other reason. In other words, they start from the assumption that God does not exist, and then ultimately conclude that God does not exist because it happened some other way, and they are not even compelled to first prove that the other way actually happened. The theoretical explanation is sufficient alone, because after all, science is merely an unbiased observer, or so they say. This approach is very common in modern science. It's often called the scientific method. One assumes the truth of the conclusion, that is, a theory, then obtains data consistent with that conclusion, that theory, and then concludes that that conclusion is true. Rarely does the scientist let the data drive the conclusion. In other words, this consistent data may actually be pointing to a very different solution, but the scientist is only testing if the initial assumed conclusion, their theory, is correct, not what is the complete understanding that can be obtained from the data. For example, if our conclusion, our theory, is true, then we should obtain certain results. We obtain these results, therefore our conclusion is true. This is a logic trap. This approach assumes that the only reason we obtain these results was because our conclusion, our theory, is correct. But in truth, a totally different reason may exist behind why we obtain these results, which is rarely looked at because we are only interested in proving that we were right all along, not in proving or discovering what is the real or whole truth. This approach can work, but is fraught with potential errors and misdirection because we are blinded, biased by our initial conclusion, our theory. Thus, we are not looking to prove or discover how it actually works, but only that our explanation regarding how it works was right all along. We see this often, that certain unproven theories are held so inviolate that even with contrary data, the theory must be maintained as true at all cost, even to the point of refusing to fund and publish any contravening research. Human nature gets in the way all the time. Returning to the question of God, these atheistic scientists never consider the possibility that their proposed solution may actually explain how God made it happen. They lock themselves in from the start by their underlying assumption that God does not exist. They are trapped by their own assumption. Their data does not drive their conclusion, their assumption drives their conclusion. Thus, they live in a circular logic trap, which they won't ever leave, because sometimes they turn out to be right. We will look at this some more in a moment. Another fundamental issue is that the author presumes to be able to discern with certainty when an answer to prayer is a coincidence and when an answer to prayer is a specific answer by God to a specific prayer. The author knows, or should know, that short of God testifying that he had granted or rejected the specific prayer request, one cannot know with any certitude whether God has answered the prayer or not. It is just like trying to ascertain who sent you that anonymous gift in the mail. You may be able to venture a guess, but you won't know until either they confess or you obtain some other evidence that proves who sent it. Further, God does not have to answer your specific prayer in your specific way. Your proposed solution to your problem need not be God's solution to your problem. God can look at what the real issue is and address that issue in an entirely different way from what you're asking for. But this would not look like God had answered your prayer when He did. For example, God may be addressing your worry, anxiety, depression, relationship issues, job issues, etc., in a way that does not involve giving you the money, the job, or whatever it is that you asked for. That is, you are asking for healing now, but instead of your temporary solution, God grants you a permanent solution. God ultimately gives you eternal life. Thus, God granted your prayer, just not in your way. One other point. God may be allowing you to reap the consequences of your decisions or actions so that you may learn patience, trust, humility, endurance, self-control. You created your mess on your own, and now you want God to bail you out, which may be a perfect opportunity for God to teach you something. So instead of complaining, perhaps you should look at how your life may be changing, or could change, because of your relationship with God. In any case, unless God tells you, it is impossible to ascertain whether the answer to a prayer was merely a coincidence as proffered by the author, or was a specific answer by God to a specific prayer. You have no way of proving or even knowing with any certitude, because no one can compel God to testify regarding what He may or may not have done. But perhaps you're saying, "Methinks thou dost protest too much, that my explanation is only a rationalization to support my pre-existing belief system." So let's walk through the author's dissertation and see. This slide of the author presents the author's first fallacy. The author's summary of the prior quotes from Christianity.com is a misinterpretation. The author presents the premises. God cares about you. True. God can perform miracles. True. All that you have to do is pray, and God will help you. Now, where did that come from? Certainly not from Christianity.com. One can see how the author is beginning to lay the foundation for his argument. If God existed, then God would answer prayers. The implication of the author's interpretation is that if you pray to God, God will do what you want Him to do. And if this does not happen, then God did not live up to His promises, and thus God does not exist. Ergo, the atheist game of fallacy. All that you have to do is pray, and God will help you. Now, a lot of people say stuff like this, but you will be hard-pressed to find this in God's scriptures. In other words, many people treat God as merely a puppet, a stooge, available at their beck and call. They treat God like God is the genie of the Bible. You read its words and rub the cover, and you get all your wishes. This could not be further from the truth. God's message has not changed from the beginning. Believe God, walk in God's ways, do what is right, and God will bless you. Asking God for help and guidance is only a small part of why we pray. Prayer is not just about getting help or stuff. Prayer is primarily about having a relationship with your loving Father in heaven, the Almighty God, creator of everything. To worship and honor God as God, and to give thanks to God for all that God does that you may not even know He has done or will do. Now, God is not under some compulsion to do as we ask, and will certainly not support or reward our sinful ways. What is most important to understand is that God blesses His children all the time without even being asked. God has made it possible for us to be reconciled to Him in spite of our sinfulness and disbelief. So we can approach Him directly and have a close, loving relationship like that of a father and child. And He freely gives this to anyone who wants it. So the author's understanding that all you have to do is pray and God will help you is not a fair interpretation of God's message and teaching. Next, the author quotes Christianity.com regarding God's 3 possible answers to prayers: yes, no, and wait. The author asserts that this is an answer that can never be wrong, and is thus an illusion. A jug of milk can answer prayers in the same way, and also be correct: yes, no, and wait. The author uses the example that a prayer for $1,000 to a jug of milk might have been fulfilled by coincidence the next day or in a few weeks, or has not been fulfilled yet, so you have to be patient and wait. Thus, the jug of milk can be just as right as God. Therefore, according to this author, all answers to prayer are only a coincidence, and God does not exist, but is only imaginary, an illusion taught to people from their childhood. However, this answer to prayer is not an illusion. It's reality. The problem is that yes, no, and wait, that is, maybe I haven't decided yet, covers all the possible answers. So of course it can never be wrong. It covers all the possibilities, because there is no fourth possible answer. Yes, no, and wait are the only possible answers, and the author does not propose any other possible answer that is not included in these three answers. The only way this answer from God can be an illusion is if God does not exist, which means that the author has taken a page from his scientific colleagues by applying the scientific method to his assumption that God does not exist in order to prove that God does not exist. Thus, more failed logic to produce more fallacy. Now, the author is correct that asking a jug of milk for $1,000 is illogical, because after all, it is only a jug of milk. It is the same thing God has been saying about idols since the beginning, and God mocks idols in the same way. We see here that the author is actually agreeing with God. Interesting. However, the author then makes the analogy that praying to God is just like praying to a jug of milk. Specifically, the author asserts that there is no difference between God and a jug of milk. That is, quote, God is no different than a jug of milk, unquote. And any other conclusion is merely a rationalization to justify a pre-existing notion that God exists and answers prayers. The author tries to rely on the potential answers from prayer as a basis to support his equivalency argument. But as you have already seen, this is a fallacy. Now let's review his example. I have combined the first two parts, so we will only look at not getting $1,000 versus getting $1,000. Let's assume you pray for $1,000. It does not matter to whom or to what. Let's assume that you do not receive the $1,000 in any reasonable length of time relative to the prayer. You cannot logically conclude anything other than that you did not receive what you asked for. There is no data. Nothing happened. It is the same thing as a wish and a hope. We all experience this frequently in our lives. You call, leave a message, and they do not call back. You submit an application, and you do not hear back, and so on. But without more information, you cannot know why they did not respond. So without more information, you cannot draw any conclusion of any kind from this prayer experience other than that you did not receive the $1,000 you asked for. Next, let's assume that you do receive exactly $1,000 shortly after the prayer, such that one may reasonably be inclined to make a causal link between the prayer and the receipt of the money. Now, you do have some data. You asked and then received precisely what you asked for. But can you legitimately make this causal connection between the prayer and the receipt of the money? Again, you have no additional data. You did not receive a call, a text, or a letter from the object of your prayer saying that they were granting your prayer request. In other words, God may have granted your prayer request even though you prayed to a jug of milk, but there is no way to find out if He did or not. Thus, you cannot definitively conclude that there is a causal link between the prayer and the money, nor can you definitively conclude that there is not such a causal link. You simply have no way of knowing with any certitude whether there is a link or not. Again, without more information, you cannot draw any conclusion of any kind from this prayer experience either, other than that you asked for and received the $1,000, and you cannot even know if the two are linked. So what does this all mean? It is impossible to conclude whether this was merely a coincidence, as proffered by the author, or a specific answer by God to a specific prayer. Unless God tells you, you have no way of knowing. That is why it is called faith. What Christianity.com is fundamentally reinforcing is that for those who believe God, walk in His ways, and do what is right, God will bless them in God's way and in God's time frame. And every Christian already knows this. So you have to ask yourself, why do you need to know whether God answered your prayer or not? If you believe God and trust God, then trust Him. And if you don't, even knowing will not likely persuade you to do so. That is, would you believe God even if He told you? Now, some might say that that answer is a prevarication to avoid admitting the truth. But unless or until one can get God to testify, there is no way to answer the question. God is the only one who knows what He may or may not have done. So you either believe He did it or you don't. It's entirely up to you. But if God won't testify or can't testify because He doesn't exist, then how can we ever know the truth about answers to prayers? I will give you a hint. Answers to prayers prove absolutely nothing about anything. Proof of God's existence is not dependent on answers to prayers. God has declared that God provides proof of His existence in the details of His creation and in the timely fulfillment of His detailed prophecies that He revealed through His prophets. God has never said that proof of His existence is in the fulfillment of prayer requests. But God has repeatedly said, "Believe me, walk in my ways, do what is right, and see what I will do for you, including giving you eternal life with peace and love as my child." The author next seeks to bolster his assertion that all answers to prayers are a coincidence by citing several, quote, valid scientific studies, unquote. Thus, we see the next assumption that is also asserted frequently by atheistic scientists. Science knows all, sees all, and is the arbiter of all truth. The author cites certain, quote, valid scientific studies, unquote, to support his proposition that prayer has no effect on a patient and may even be detrimental to the patient's well-being. The author asserts that these studies are valid and implies that the studies were properly designed to support his conclusions. So we will briefly look at his first and third cited studies. The second article merely makes a generalized conclusory statement without any details or reference citations, so there is really nothing one can evaluate. The author's first cited study. The author's first cited study was testing whether the patient knowing that someone was praying for them would result in a change in outcomes. Quote, one group was told that strangers would pray for them. A second group was told strangers might or might not pray for them. And a third group was not prayed for at all, unquote. But this test only tests whether the mental state of the patient can affect a change in outcomes, and does not address whether God intervened to cause a change in outcomes. This study would only support a determination whether a patient's mental state contributes to better outcomes, not whether God intervened to alter the outcome for the patient. The third study says exactly that. Quote, a positive attitude does not improve the chances of surviving cancer, unquote. Thus, these studies do not actually address the question of whether prayers to God result in God intervening to cause any changes in outcomes for the patient, but only whether the mental state of the patient affects outcomes. Further, the author does not cite or address the scientific studies that contravene his assertions. For example, see the published article cited below in the comments. But instead, dramatically concludes that all scientific studies prove that prayer has no effect, and therefore all answers to prayer are a coincidence. These studies do not support these broad, sweeping conclusions. It is not even clear how one could design a study that could test whether God intervened on behalf of a patient or not. So it is unclear whether science could ever answer the question whether God intervenes or not. In fact, science admits that one of the reasons science assumes that God does not exist is because God cannot be put in a test tube, that science cannot conduct tests on God. In any case, these studies certainly did not test this question and do not support the author's conclusions. So is science worthy of its supremacy? That is the assumption that science knows all, sees all, and is the arbiter of all truth. The history of science is filled with a continuous flurry of conclusions that frequently conflict with each other. Science proclaims that it is continuously refining its theories as it searches for more, better data and evidence to support or explain its theories and observations. So when contrary data arises, science simply amends or drops one theory for another and then moves on its merry way as if its years of false assumptions, false teachings, and false conclusions were not relevant to its veracity. Science is never held to account. It always gets a pass. For example, 60 years ago, the universe was taught to be oscillating, first expanding, and then collapsing, and then re-expanding, etc., forever. Thus, this oscillating universe has always existed and explains the origin of the universe. Now today, the universe is taught to be a one-time universe, with a starting point about 14 billion years ago, and cannot collapse upon itself because of dark matter. But science can provide no evidence regarding how it all started in the first place. Funny how this latest explanation sounds a lot like Genesis. Curious. Most importantly, science tells us that some things we know definitively that they are either true or false. But some things will require that we wait until we have more knowledge or better understanding or better technology or a better experimental design or a better theory to answer the question. Thus, science must keep massaging its theories and asserts the premise that each follow-on theory is always an improvement over the last theory. I wonder if that's true either. Finally, science hopes that it may eventually, someday, be able to truly answer our questions, assuming science will ever be able to answer all our questions. But wait a minute, is science saying that science answers our questions with yes, no, and wait? But doesn't the author assert that answers of yes, no, and wait are just an illusion? Is the author asserting that science is only imaginary? Wow, how existential. Does anything really exist? The author now repackages his argument. The author argues that if prayer was effective, then all those who pray should have different outcomes in life from those who do not pray. Again, we see a parallel to the logic traps we discussed earlier. If God existed, God would answer prayers, so people who pray would get more stuff, more blessings than people who don't. Another atheistic game of fallacy. The first false assumption in the author's premise is that God only blesses those who pray, that there are no blessings for those who do not pray. The next two false assumptions are that all people who pray are equivalent, and that all prayers are equivalent. And so if God existed, then God would grant most prayers no matter who or what or when or how or why the prayer was made. We are back to the genie of the Bible scenario. Based on the scriptures, God has never said that he would entertain every prayer, much less grant every prayer or even most prayers. God has said, believe him, walk in his ways, do what is right, and he will bless you. And God does not even require that you ask for his blessing. Finally, the author reveals his bias. The author asserts that all opposing views are just rationalizations, unlike the author's views, which are all rational and logical. So, speaking of straw man arguments, the author's suggested rationalizations, quote, God cannot be tested, unquote, or, quote, God must remain hidden, unquote, are absurd. God actually invites you to have a relationship with him. Believe him, walk in his ways, do what is right, and see how God will bless you. Also, God has not been trying to remain hidden, but actually wants to be recognized and worshiped by everyone. God specifically instructed Israel to be his witnesses to the nations regarding who God is and what God did for Israel. And now God instructs the followers of Jesus to be his witnesses regarding who God and Jesus are and what they have done for all of humankind and creation. The author then invites everyone to use their intelligence to understand his simple truth, that the reason why prayer has no effect is because God is imaginary. In other words, all smart, intelligent people think just like the author. And if you don't, then you are either deluded by indoctrination from your early childhood, or you lack the intelligence to logically understand the argument that anyone with an ounce of common sense would understand. Thus, all smart people know that God does not exist, but is imaginary. However, you have seen that the author's assumptions, assertions, and arguments are not supported by fact or logic, and thus the author's final conclusion is not in any way sustainable despite his protestation. Now, I have to admit that atheists do have the greater challenge. They have to prove that something does not exist. They have to prove a negative. However, we can show that there is a reasonable rational basis to conclude that God exists, that God made his creation for a purpose, and what that purpose is. God is making a family of children for himself who want to be like him and want to be with him forever. God revealed his plan and purpose for his creation from the very beginning. God then periodically revealed through his prophets what he was going to do next as God's plan unfolded. For example, Isaiah and Daniel prophesied more than 500 years before the events who the Messiah would be, how God would send the Messiah to Israel, that the Messiah would die and then live again, and that all this would occur just after 23 AD. I challenge you to watch the 20-part YouTube video series entitled God, Fact, Fantasy, Fallacy, or Fraud, and see if you too conclude that God exists and has a plan and purpose for his creation. The link is below in the comments. It can change your life. I wish you Godspeed in finding the truth.